high. They were surrounded by 120,000 soldiers in a valley of ice. The temperature had plummeted to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, so cold that blood froze before it could hit the snow, and morphine syrettes had to be thawed in a medic's mouth to work. General Smith looked at his starving, frostbitten men and uttered the words that would define American grit forever. "Retreat? Hell, we're just attacking in a different direction." This is not just a story of a battle. It is the story of how 30,000 men fought a ghost army and the elements themselves to achieve the impossible. Part 1. The Long March into the Trap. The year was 1950. The American-led UN forces were surging north through the rugged mountains of North Korea. General Douglas MacArthur promised the boys would be home by Christmas. The mood was optimistic, almost arrogant. The 1st Marine Division, alongside elements of the Army's 7th Infantry, pushed toward the Chosin Reservoir, a man-made lake surrounded by jagged, prehistoric peaks. They didn't know that Mao Zedong had personally ordered the total annihilation of the blue-eyed devils. Hidden in the caves and the dense tree line were the 9th Army Group of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. They moved only at night, invisible to aerial reconnaissance, sleeping in the snow without fires. They were a ghost army, waiting for the Americans to stretch their supply lines thin. Part 2. The White Hell begins. On the night of November 27th, the trap snapped shut. The silence of the mountains was shattered by the shrill sound of brass bugles and wooden rattles. Thousands of Chinese soldiers emerged from the darkness, wearing thin cotton-padded uniforms, screaming and charging into the American perimeters. The brutality was instant. The cold, weapons jammed as the oil froze. Men had to urinate on their M1 Garands just to get the bolts to move. The hunger. Sea rations were frozen solid. To eat, soldiers had to keep cans of beans against their skin for hours. The foxholes. The ground was as hard as granite. Digging a foxhole took hours of pounding with pickaxes, leaving men exhausted before the fighting even began. Part 3. The Breakout from Udimni. By early December, the UN forces were completely encircled. They were 78 miles from the sea, trapped in a narrow mountain pass with only one primitive road leading out. The world thought they were finished. The American press was preparing obituaries for the entire 1st Marine Division, but the Marines didn't see it as a defeat. Colonel Chesty Puller, a legend among men, famously remarked, "We've been looking for the enemy for some time now. We've finally found him. We're surrounded. That simplifies things." The march to the sea began. It wasn't a retreat, it was a fighting breakout. Every mile was paid for blood. The Frozen Chosin veterans became known as the Chosen Few. Part 4. The Miracle at Funchalen Pass. The climax of the escape happened at a bridge over a 1,500-foot chasm. The Chinese had blown it up, trapping the American vehicle column. Without that bridge, thousands of men and their wounded would be slaughtered. In one of the incredible feats in military history, the U.S. Air Force flew in massive 2-ton portable bridge sections. They dropped them by parachute, something never attempted before. Despite the wind and the snow, the Marines recovered the sections, bolted them together under heavy fire, and crossed the abyss. Part 5. The Ghost Ships of Hungnam. When the survivors finally reached the port of Hungnam, they didn't just bring themselves, they brought their dead, their equipment, and nearly 100,000 North Korean refugees who were fleeing the communist advance. It was the greatest rescue by sea in history. The last ship to leave, the SS Meredith Victory, was a freighter designed to carry 12 people.
It departed with 14,000 refugees packed like sardines. During the 3-day journey to safety, 5 babies were born on that ship. Not a single soul was lost. Epilogue: The Legacy. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir remains a testament to human endurance. The Americans suffered 17,000 casualties, mostly from frostbite. The Chinese suffered an estimated 50,000 to 80,000. To this day, the chosen few are remembered in the U.S. as the men who walked through hell and brought their brothers home. Chapter 2: The Symphony of Bugles and Steel. As the sun dipped behind the Taebaek Mountains on the evening of November 27th, a haunting silence settled over the Chosin Reservoir. The temperature plummeted to negative 35 degrees Fahrenheit. In the perimeter of the 5th and 7th Marines at Udumne, men huddled in shallow pits. Then the silence was murdered. A single, high-pitched bugle blasted the frozen air. It was followed by a cacophony of whistles and wooden rattles. To the young Americans, it sounded like a demonic carnival. From the tree line, the ghost army appeared. Thousands of Chinese soldiers, shadows in white quilted uniforms, charged across the frozen crust of the earth. The mechanical nightmare. The Americans reached for their weapons, only to face a terrifying realization: the cold was a second enemy. The heavy lubricating oil on the M1 Garands had turned into a thick frozen sludge. Bolts wouldn't cycle. Men had to frantically strip their rifles, wiping away the oil and praying that the dry friction of metal on metal would be enough to fire. In the machine gun pits, the water-cooled Brownings were useless. The coolant had frozen solid. The Marines began using antifreeze, or, in desperate moments, urinating on the barrels just to keep the mechanisms from seizing. The human wave. The Chinese tactics were brutal and selfless. They attacked in human waves. The first row of attackers often didn't even have rifles. They carried grenades to throw into the foxholes. When the first wave fell, the second wave picked up their weapons and kept coming. Corporal James Riley, a rifleman from New Jersey, recalled the sight. They didn't look like men. They looked like a tide of white fabric coming up the hill. We shot until the barrels were red hot, but they just kept stepping over their own dead. Chapter 3: The Foxhole Pharmacy. By the morning of November 28th, the valleys were littered with the fallen. But for the Navy corpsmen, the medics, the battle was just beginning. In the extreme cold, medical science failed. Morphine, the plastic syrettes, were frozen like sticks of ice. Medics had to keep them in their mouths, tucked against their cheeks, to thaw them enough to inject into the wounded. Blood plasma. It was useless. The bottles would crack in the cold, and the liquid wouldn't flow through the tubes. The frozen blessing. In a strange twist of fate, the cold saved many lives. The sub-zero temperatures constricted blood vessels so quickly that many men with severed limbs didn't bleed to death. Their wounds were flash-frozen shut. The men learned a new, grim vocabulary. Frostbite wasn't just a cold sensation. It was a blackening of the flesh that turned toes and fingers into brittle charcoal. If you took your boots off to dry your socks, your feet would swell so instantly that you could never get the boots back on. Thousands chose to let their feet rot inside their boots rather than face the wind barefoot.
Chapter 4: Fox Company at Totong Pass. While the main body of Marines was at Udumne, a single company, Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, was assigned to hold a tiny, isolated hill at Totong Pass. If they lost that hill, the only road out for 10,000 men would be cut off. For 5 nights, 240 men under Captain William Barber were surrounded by an entire Chinese regiment. They were a tiny island in a sea of 4,000 enemy troops. The conditions were apocalyptic. They were out of food.
Their radio batteries were dying in the cold. On the third night, the Chinese reached the crest of the hill. The fighting turned into a primal struggle of bayonets, entrenching tools, and bare fists. When a relief column finally reached them days later, only 82 men of Fox Company could still walk, but they had held the pass. Because of them, the road stayed open. Because of them, the 1st Marine Division still had a chance to breathe. Chapter 5. The Bridge to Nowhere. By December 5th, the breakout was in full swing. A 14-mile-long convoy of trucks, tanks, and limping men stretched along the narrow, winding mountain road. Then came the catastrophe. At a place called Funchulin Pass, the Chinese had destroyed the bridge over a massive hydroelectric gatehouse. On one side of the road was a sheer mountain wall, on the other, a 1,500-foot vertical drop. There was no way around. The column stopped. 10,000 men were now sitting ducks for the Chinese snipers hidden in the heights. The impossible solution. General Smith called for an aerial miracle. He asked for treadway bridge spans to be dropped from the sky. Each steel span weighed 2 tons. No one had ever dropped something that heavy by parachute into a combat zone. On December 7th, 8 C-119 flying boxcars roared over the pass. They deployed massive parachutes. One span was destroyed on impact, and another fell into enemy hands, but 4 landed within the Marine perimeter. Under heavy fire, Marine engineers, men who hadn't slept in a week, worked with frozen fingers to bolt the bridge together. They used timber, sandbags, and the sheer force of will. As the last bolt was tightened, the first M46 Patton tank creaked across the abyss. The cork was out of the bottle. The chosen few were heading for the sea. Chapter 6. The Gauntlet of Fire. The bridge at Funchulin Pass was open, but the ordeal was far from over. The road to the sea was a narrow ribbon of ice carved into the side of the mountains, and every inch of it was zeroed in by Chinese mortars. The column became a moving fortress. Tanks led the way, their treads grinding over the frozen remains of equipment and, tragically, the bodies of those who had fallen earlier. The Marines walked on the flanks, their eyes scanning the ridges. Whenever a muzzle flash sparked from the heights, the Marines would peel off into the snow, climb the vertical slopes, and silence the threat in brutal, close-quarters combat. The Tootsie Roll Miracle. Amid the horror, one of the strangest stories of the war occurred. A tactical air controller called for a resupply of mortar rounds, using the code name Tootsie Rolls. The radio operator on the other end didn't have the code sheet and took the request literally. Hours later, parachutes drifted down carrying thousands of actual Tootsie Roll candies. At first, the Marines were furious, but they soon realized the candy was a lifesaver. It was the only food that wouldn't freeze solid. They could keep it in their mouths until it softened, providing a quick burst of sugar and energy. More importantly, the chewed-up candy acted as a cold-welled putty used by the mechanics to plug bullet holes in the radiators of the trucks and jeeps, keeping the convoy moving. Chapter 7. The Perimeter at Hungnam. On December 11th, the first elements of the 1st Marine Division reached the port city of Hungnam. They looked like ghosts, beards matted with ice, uniforms shredded, skin blackened by frostbite and gunpowder, but they marched in cadence. They didn't arrive as a defeated mob. They arrived as a disciplined unit, bringing their wounded and their equipment with them. However, the port was a scene of desperation. As the word spread that the Americans were leaving, nearly 100,000 North Korean civilians swarmed the docks. They were families who had helped the UN forces or simply feared the retribution of the approaching Chinese army. They stood in the freezing surf, begging to be taken away. The U.S. Navy faced a choice: leave the civilians to their fate or risk the entire fleet to save them. The decision was made to evacuate every single soul. Chapter 8. the ship of miracles. Among the dozens of ships in the harbor was the SS Meredith Victory, a Victory-class freighter. Her captain, Leonard LaRue, looked at the masses of shivering refugees on the pier. His ship was designed to carry a crew of 47 and perhaps a few passengers. "I will take as many as I can," LaRue said. The crew began loading. They used cargo slings to lower people into the holds. They packed them onto the decks, shoulder to shoulder, until there was no room to move. When the ship finally pulled away from the pier, this 450-foot cargo ship was carrying 14,000 people. They had no food, no water, no heat, and no doctors. The ship sailed through mine-infested waters while Chinese artillery shelled the harbor behind them. For 3 days, the refugees stood in total silence, huddled together for warmth. When the ship reached the safety of Georgi Island, the count was still 14,000, plus 5 babies born during the voyage, whom the crew nicknamed Kimchi 1 through Kimchi 5.
Chapter 9. The Final Blast. On December 24, 1950, Christmas Eve, the last of the American rear guard stepped onto the transport ships. The port of Hungnam had been turned into a massive supply dump that couldn't be moved. To prevent the Chinese from using the port or the supplies, the Navy SEALs and Underwater Demolition Teams, UDT, set the largest non-nuclear explosion of the war. As the ships pulled out into the Sea of Japan, the entire horizon turned orange. The docks, the cranes, and the remaining ammunition stores vanished in a mushroom cloud of fire. The home by Christmas promise had been broken, but a different miracle had occurred. The 1st Marine Division had survived an encirclement that should have been their grave. They had broken 7 Chinese divisions and saved 100,000 civilians in the process. The legacy of the chosen few. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir changed the American psyche. It remains the most decorated battle in U.S. Marine Corps history, with 17 Medals of Honor awarded. The veterans of that winter never forgot the sound of the bugles or the bite of the wind. They returned to a USA that was just beginning to understand the Cold War, bringing with them a grit that would define a generation. Today, the survivors still meet, though their numbers are dwindling. They call themselves the chosen few, not because there were few of them, but because few could have survived what they did. Chapter 10. The Soldier's Shadow, a personal account. While the history books record the movements of divisions and the strategies of generals, the true story of Chosin was written in the frost-nipped journals of the men on the ground. To truly understand the 50,000-word depth of this struggle, we must look at a single life. Private First Class Elias Thorne, a 19-year-old from the rolling hills of Kentucky who had never seen snow deeper than an inch before landing in Korea. By December 12th, Elias sat on the deck of a transport ship, his hands wrapped in thick bandages. He couldn't feel his fingers, but he could feel the ghost of the cold. In his pocket was a small leather-bound notebook. His entry for that day read, "The silence of the sea is louder than the bugles. My boots are still fused to my socks by dried blood and ice. They say we are safe now, but I still look at the horizon, expecting to see the white-quilted uniforms of the ghosts. I saw a man trade a diamond ring for a single Tootsie Roll. Value has a different meaning when you're dying." The psychological toll. For Elias and thousands like him, the battle didn't end at Hungnam. The Chosin tremor, a permanent shaking of the hands caused by extreme nerve damage from the cold, would follow many to their graves. The American public back home saw the newsreels of the big picture, but they didn't see the men who woke up screaming in the middle of the night because the sound of a wind chime reminded them of the Chinese whistles. Chapter 11. The Strategic Ripple. Historians often debate, was Chosin a victory or a defeat? The tactical reality. The UN forces were forced to withdraw from North Korea. In that sense, the Chinese achieved their goal of clearing the north. The strategic reality. The Chinese 9th Army Group was so utterly decimated by the Marines that they were effectively removed from the war for months. Mao's plan to annihilate the American presence failed. The Marines didn't just escape, they broke the back of the elite Chinese units. The Polar Bear Regiment. One of the most tragic and astonishing subplots of the battle was the fate of the U.S. Army's Task Force Faith, 31st Regimental Combat Team. While the Marines were on the west side of the reservoir, these soldiers were on the east. They bore the brunt of the initial Chinese onslaught without the same level of air support. Of the 3,000 men in Task Force Faith, only about 1,000 made it to the Marine lines, and only 385 were able-bodied. Their sacrifice is often overshadowed by the Marine legend, but their stand bought the time General Smith needed to consolidate his forces. In 2012, the U.S. Navy finally awarded the unit the Presidential Unit Citation over 60 years after their frozen stand. Chapter 12. The Modern Miracle, South Korea Today. There is a reason this story resonates so deeply with American and Korean audiences today. The 100,000 refugees saved at Hungnam weren't just numbers. Among those refugees was a couple fleeing the north. Years later, in South Korea, they had a son. That son grew up to be Moon Jae-in, the 19th president of South Korea. Without the miracle of Hungnam, without the SS Meredith victory, the history of the entire Korean peninsula, and perhaps the world, would be fundamentally different. The Americans at Chosin didn't just fight for a ridge, they fought for the survival of a people. Final reflection: the fire in the ice. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir stands as a grim masterpiece of military history. It is a story of total failure, intelligence and planning, transformed into total triumph, human spirit, and tactical brilliance. For the USA audience, Chosin is the ultimate underdog story. It's the story of the Frozen Chosin, men who were told they were finished, who were surrounded, outgunned, and freezing to death, but who looked at the impossible and said, "Not today." To turn this into a full-length historical novel or great American war story, you can expand the following threads. The political tension, chapters alternating between MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo and Mao's hidden command post in Beijing. The home front, a parallel story of a wife in San Francisco or a mother in Kentucky waiting for letters that stopped coming during the blackout weeks of December. The enemy's perspective include the story of a Chinese peasant soldier shivering in the same cold, fighting for a cause he barely understands, showing the universal tragedy of war. Technical deep dives, detailed chapters on the engineering of the Funchalen Pass Bridge and the naval coordination of the 193-ship evacuation fleet. Chapter 13. The Valley of the Shadow. As the massive explosion at Hungnam faded into a low rumble behind the retreating fleet, the story of the Chosin Reservoir transitioned from a battle of bullets to a battle of memory. For the survivors, the war didn't end when they reached the warm air of Japan or the docks of San Diego. They carried the Chosin chill in their marrow. The long recovery. Back in the United States, the public was paralyzed. The news of the great breakout reached the front pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post. For the first time, the American people realized this wasn't a police action. It was a brutal, existential conflict. In military hospitals from Yokosuka to California, wardrooms were filled with men whose limbs were wrapped in thick white gauze. The doctors had to develop new techniques for treating mass frostbite. Many men lost their feet. Others lost the ability to ever feel warmth again. There's a famous story of a Chosin veteran who 40 years later, in the heat of a Florida summer, would still shiver uncontrollably if he heard the sound of a bugle or a whistle. Chapter 14. The Commander's Ghost. General Douglas MacArthur, once the untouchable hero of the Pacific, saw his reputation fracture at the Chosin. His insistence that the Chinese would not intervene was proven tragically wrong.
Meanwhile, the men on the ground looked to leaders like General Oliver P. Smith and Colonel Chesty Puller. Chesty Puller, who earned his 5th Navy Cross at Chosin, became the personification of the Marine spirit. He didn't sleep in a heated tent. He slept in the snow with his men. He didn't eat hot meals while his privates chewed frozen Tootsie Rolls. When a reporter asked him about the dire situation, Puller famously barked, "All right, they're on our left, they're on our right, they're in front of us, they're behind us, they can't get away this time." This defiant humor became the psychological armor that allowed the Americans to keep their sanity when the world was literally freezing around them. Chapter 15. The Unseen Hero, the Corsair Pilots. We cannot finish this story without looking up. The only reason the chosen few weren't completely overrun was the Blue Angels of Death, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps pilots flying F-4U Corsairs. These pilots flew in conditions that should have grounded any aircraft. They flew so low through the mountain passes that they could see the faces of the enemy. When the Marines on the ground ran out of ammunition, the Corsairs would fly dry runs, buzzing the Chinese lines at 400 miles per hour just to scare them into foxholes, giving the exhausted infantry a few seconds of peace. One pilot, Thomas Hudner, intentionally crashed his own plane behind enemy lines to try and save his wingman, Jesse Brown, the first African-American naval aviator, who had been shot down. It was a display of brotherhood that transcended race and rank in an era when the U.S. military was only beginning to desegregate. Conclusion: the eternal flame. The Korean War is often called the Forgotten War, wedged between the glory of World War II and the trauma of Vietnam. But for those who know the story of the Chosin Reservoir, it is unforgettable. The miracle of survival. The stats are staggering. Temperature, lowest recorded at -44 degrees Fahrenheit. Odds, 1 American for every 4 to 6 Chinese soldiers. Medals, the most medals of honor ever awarded for a single engagement in U.S. military history. Today, if you visit the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Virginia, there's a room kept at a permanent chilling temperature. It's meant to give visitors a tiny, microscopic taste of what the chosen few endured. The last man standing. As the decades pass, the number